Yeah.
So, for everyone who's joined us already, our tradition for these webinars is to start them at like 1 or 2 minutes after the posted time. You know how it is when the phone buzzes and tells you you have an event to get on Zoom for. You got to scramble to a screen. You start up Zoom, it needs to update. Your computer has to restart, whatever. So we give everyone a minute or two of grace to find their way here.
But thank you to everyone who is here and joining us tonight.
Yes.
Excited.
Yeah.
Gonna be good.
This is one of our favorites of the year to do for sure. We do a lot of webinars on a lot of topics, but rarely do we get to kind of bring it all together like this.
Yes.
It's funny, everyone who like knows this webinar, who knew it was doing it tonight, was like, have fun at your webinar tonight. I'm like, thanks. That's not normally, I feel like, the prevailing like phrase that you use before you go off on the webinar, but
What, have fun?
yeah.
I always have fun. I don't know how much fun everyone else has while I'm talking about standardized testing, but I love it.
Well, they have fun, Jim, because you know what you're talking about.
It doesn't necessarily make it fun.
If you have the
Sometimes
right
medicine
mindset,
tastes like medicine, is all I'm saying.
if you have the right mindset and you understand that some medicines, while they may not taste really well, they're really good for you.
That's right.
Yeah, like what? Yeah, and then there's the Flintstone vitamins of the world, which tasted delicious. And then
I'm sensing a digital SAT metaphor.
now that you say it like that, yeah. It's funny. I still think back to years ago when the idea of a digital test was like first being floated. And there was this survey that went out, and I don't remember who conducted it, but the survey showed that while 2/3 of parents thought that a digital test was a great idea, at the time, and this was probably 7, 8 years ago, students by a 2-to-1 margin preferred pencil over paper. And it is interesting. I'm curious to hear, Jim, any feedback you've gotten, because I've had some students recently say to me, yeah, I didn't like, the digital test was shorter, but I missed pencil and paper, and we feel that made a difference.
Yeah, that is a strange thing with the new test because students are used to taking important tests on pencil and paper still. So it's, while they are digital natives in every way and do a lot on computers and tablets at school, high stakes testing and especially math testing, they're more used to doing on pencil and paper. So it is true. I think a lot of students do prefer the new format, but I've definitely heard that feedback from some. I think we would have gotten totally different answers on that, before and after the pandemic too. Which is a little bit of a preview of what we're going to talk about tonight. For those of you who joined in the meantime, I'll repeat myself. We usually start these things 1 or 2 minutes after the kind of stated start time. So this is still the small talk period at the beginning before we really jump into the presentation. So stay tuned for the next couple minutes while we talk about the weather, the Phillies, the digital SAT, etc. And then we'll hop in around 7:02 to the slides.
And for those students who really, truly want to keep the paper and pencil, you get one piece of scratch paper automatically when you take the digital SAT. You can request a second one. You can do your calculating. You can do some note taking. You can do some paper penciling.
Exactly. And the scratch paper thing, it's ridiculous that you get one page and then you have to actually ask for a second and you only get two. It's absolutely absurd. So I apologize to you all students that that's the case. But my one piece of strategy advice there is ask for the second one when you're like 3/4 of the way done with the first, like halfway through the second side of that piece of scratch paper, because you have to raise your hand and they have to bring it to you. You're not allowed to amble around the room during a high stakes standardized test. So you don't know how long the proctor is going to take to actually look at you. So you got to get that non-dominant hand in the air while you're working for a little while to make sure you get that paper in a timely manner.
I would just ask for the second one when they're passing out the first one.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Like,
You could ask. It's
If you know it's inevitable, just do it.
so much on test day depends on the proctor you get. Like some of them, it probably says in the instructions, like if needed. And then it just depends on how, stickler to the rules that specific proctor wants to be. So much of the stuff on test day really comes down to how the proctor runs the room. But yes, certainly shoot your shot and try to ask for the second one up front. If it works, great. If it doesn't, just be ready.
I had my first session today for proctoring myself. I'm going to help out at two different high schools in the area, proctoring AP and IB exams.
Very
So
exciting.
we were doing a bit on the AP today.
Cool. Did you get music theory again? I know it's your favorite.
Oh, no. That's the best exam. Get to listen to
Listen
great
to classical music and hang out.
Best ever.
All right. Well, it is 7:03 now, so we can officially jump into the presentation. So let me fire up the slides here. Welcome on in to our 2024 edition of the State of Admissions webinar. Ignore the part on the title slide where it says early admissions. I'm joined by Eric Carlin, one of our co-founders here at Ivy Experience, and Sigas Vani, a renowned college fairy, former admissions officer, high school counselor, independent counselor, and we're here to just kind of delve into what we learned about college admissions in 2024. So with that said, the first thing and sort of the frame for tonight's discussion is really about a timeline of recent college admissions history. And I say that because we saw a pretty big shakeup in 2020 to the college admissions world, to say the least. And it's really set the tone for the discussion of college admissions that's kind of come since then. So we've broken out recent college admissions history into sort of 4 phases. And we're going to walk you through the developments through those phases, because I think understanding this little bit of history is really important to see kind of the trends that we're in now. So 2019 and earlier, this will be what we call the old normal. And then 2020 and 2021, peak pandemic times, colleges making a lot of adjustments to policies, high schools making a lot of adjustments to the way they run things. 2022 and 2023 was a period of sort of finding a new equilibrium coming out of the pandemic. And it seems like enough trends have sort of stabilized now in 2024 for us to feel like we've reached a level of new normal. So with that said, we'll jump into the 2019 and earlier discussion. So Eric, colleges have always become more competitive every year, but just explain how different it was before the pandemic and after.
Yeah, I mean, really, I think that before the pandemic, it was, you had far fewer colleges with single-digit acceptance rates, right? And, or what we would call, this wasn't our term, but I've loved adapting it, like that highly rejective college. Once, like, pre-2019, those likelies in many cases have become targets. Targets have become reaches. And, I know I'm spoiling a little bit ahead here, but reaches have become such low single-digit acceptance numbers that there's actually a technical industry term now that's, they're called lottery schools. So it's always as a whole been gradual. Sigas, I don't want to steal his really great analogy for this, which he'll allude to later, but there would be individual schools that on a year to year would change. It just was a much different time. The temperature was lower, I think is a good way to phrase it.
Yeah, one way the temperature showed itself is the fact that students rarely applied to more than 8 to 12 colleges.
Yeah.
It was extremely rare at this point in time. And I would say, test scores were required almost everywhere. There were schools, test optional has been around since the 70s. And, but it was just kind of confined to small liberal arts colleges. And obviously that changed during the pandemic. Wait lists and deferrals at the time were generally an indication that you should really shift priorities and not put a lot of kind of time and energy into the follow-up. Do what you want to do if it's your dream school, but it's, you know, unlikely to go in your favor. And then we started to see a trend that's continued since then, where the small liberal arts colleges have lost market share and become less popular with students relative to other colleges, types of colleges. And they started to reduce their number of essays on their application as a result of that. Now, for those of you not in the business, so to speak, essays are a barrier to application, right? It's another step students have to take. The fewer essays you require, especially if you're on the common application, the more applicants you're going to get, because students just have to like check a box, answer a couple brief questions, and then they send the fee and apply to your school. So removing extra essay questions is a way to boost application numbers. And we already saw small liberal arts colleges starting to sort of need to take those steps to boost applicants.
Yeah, well, and it was a real trend because students were starting to say, well, wait a second, I can get high academics, but also I can go to this big school with the rah-rah sports spirit scene. It really was an I can have it all moment as the bigger public schools were starting to gain popularity and traction. But I would say it was still at a steady pace. There was the out-of-state schools like the UNCs, Chapel Hill, the UVA, the UCLAs of the world, but even Michigan at that time, which has obviously exploded, it was a steady increase. And it was a precursor to what happened. But like so many things, you know, with the pandemic, the pandemic didn't cause something to change, but it was an exacerbator and an accelerator. And I think that's, I mean, in your case, Jim, with your testing.
Yeah, and so the first domino to fall in pandemic times was that every SAT and ACT date was canceled for the foreseeable future, and all colleges went test optional by necessity. They wouldn't have been able to admit a class, or not every college would have been able to admit a class if they weren't going to allow students to apply without these test scores when they just couldn't take the test. For that reason, we've seen since then a spike in colleges' middle 50% reported test scores. And the reason for that is that the students who don't send the scores are typically scoring below the college's median. So you're getting that whole range raising as a result of that. So that was kind of the first and most obvious domino to fall. The kind of thing that came on the heels of that was what I call it feels like this is our year application spike, where a lot of, you know, students were thinking opportunistically, well, you know, I know I can't get a 1550 plus on the SAT, but now that I don't have to share my SAT, I can apply to a hyper selective school and I'm going to have a stronger chance. Now, a lot of these students didn't have the other application factors that you would need for admission at these schools, the strong extracurriculars, the elite academics on the transcript, you know, taking the hardest courses available at the school. So we didn't see those students have success. But what we did see was a massive rise in applications per student as more students felt like they could throw more darts, so to speak. And go ahead, Sigus.
It's interesting, Jim, back in 2017, before all of this happened, the average number of colleges to which a U.S. high school student applied was 1.8. Now, not necessarily in the population with which we work most closely, because we're talking about a small slice of individuals, families, students that really cluster around the more selective colleges. The fact of the matter is, roughly 40% of the students that go to college go to their local community college, and there's no reason to apply to more than one school because you're in to do. But it just seems to me that we have to keep in mind that these spikes that we see are for a specific population. And I know we're talking mostly to that population, but this doesn't really represent the country as a whole.
Yeah, very fair to say, and definitely good to keep in mind. We're going to be talking mostly about selective college admissions here. There's a whole world of college admissions beyond that,
Right.
for sure.
I think it's also worth noting before we get to the other parts of this that, you know, hindsight is 2020, right? And, you know, when we talked about that, feels like this is our year, it's easy to look back and, you know, laugh about it because we saw that it did become a pervasive trend. But when it started happening, and to be clear, if anyone was a student, you know, a parent I worked with and we had this conversation, you know, I say this completely uncritically, but I got call after call after call that year where it was like, you know, we're having this thought. And I don't know if you've heard this from anyone else, but it feels like this is our year. And at the time, it was tough to assess how widespread that sentiment was. And it was tough to shoot that down because we didn't know what the application numbers were going to be. And at the, you know, at the time, my response was always like, I don't know what's going to happen, right? It feels like the amount I'm hearing this, applications are going to go up and it's going to get more competitive. But maybe you're right. Maybe it's just to that point you just made, Jim. Maybe it's the smaller circle we're in. But of course, in retrospect, it wasn't. And the big thing was that test optional. And you talked a moment ago about essays being a barrier to application. But I think what we really saw was that students, you know, saw the SAT and ACT not as a barrier to application in this process in general, but to very specific schools where they said, look, I'm doing all this other stuff. The SAT or ACT is the only thing holding me back. And, you know, looking back, at the time, going test optional was necessity. Test centers were closed all across the country. But then what evolved, and I know we're going to get into this in a second, was that whole issue of yield. And I'm going to let Sigas explain yield, but just to set him up for this, that part wasn't new, right? If you look back, and I even just Googled this because I forgot the year, and it's actually staggering to me how far back this was. But I always remember there was an op-ed, like a humorous satire piece in the New York Times about how Stanford had finally achieved a 0% acceptance rate, and all the other, you know, peer institutions were incredibly jealous of how Stanford achieved this finally. It feels like, especially with the acceleration and exacerbation, I mentioned that this should be more recent, but do you guys remember what year that came out and was published?
I would guess like 2006 or something. I don't know.
All right, later than that, but 26.
I know it was by Frank Bruni, who's amazing.
Yeah, it was 2016, right? So that speaks to how long this pervasive yield conversation's been going on. Sigas, do you want to explain yields here? Because I think that's an essential term for the rest of the conversation tonight.
Gladly, Eric. I also want to point something out too. As we in the United States were going through all these application spikes and people were applying to 15, 20 different schools, the United Kingdom, which is served by a common application called the University and College Application Service, never once changed its upper limit. 5 applications, and that's it. You can apply to only 5 different programs at 5 different universities. That's it. It never changed for that. Well, yield became visible, shall we say. It's always been around, but yield has been visible because our dear friend, the U.S. News and World Report, picked it up as one of their primary variables. Okay, now let me just say straight out that the U.S. News and World Report system has little to no scientific validation. First and foremost, what might be important to me in a college could be utterly unimportant to you. So let's just start with that. But the U.S. News and World Report used it in their mix to determine selectivity levels and ranking levels and all that business. Yield is this. It's the number of students that say yes back to us when we say yes to them. So, for example, if I admit 500 students and 250 of them say yes back to me, my yield ratio is 50%. That's the yield. Now, since that became a more important variable, colleges paid more attention to it. And think about it, it's rather easy to manipulate yield. So let's say, for example, that I want a first-year class of 500 students. Normally, I would probably need to take, even the most selective schools would probably need to take 1,000, 1,500 students to be able to yield 500 students. But if I want to keep my yield at a really high level, let's say I only accept 750 students. So now I get 400 students to say yes, because of course those 750 were the top candidates that I admitted, and now my yield level spikes. Well, that still leaves me short, right? Well, no. What did I do with the other students that I really wanted to be in my school? I put them on a wait list. But I had every intention of admitting them from that wait list. This wasn't a wait list that was going to be like, oh, well, let's see. I don't think we have room for. We knew we would have room for them. We constructed the class so we would have room for them. We left room for them to do. So yield became another one of those things that took on a rather specious, which is a great SAT word, something that seems more important than it actually is, rather specious influence in this whole process. I mean, if I really wanted to delve into this, I could go into where colleges have literally put thousands of students on the wait list while admitting a much smaller number. And now I can see they have a yield of 65%. They must be really popular and really good.
So I guess in fairness, right, you know, I think especially because we probably have a bunch of parents of seniors whose students are on wait lists right now, it's worth saying, like, you know, we don't want to build up too much hope with the wait lists, right? And we'll get to this later.
Sure.
Right. But there's a lot of other ways to manipulate that yield too. For instance, you know, and I know you loathe this policy, but you offer early decision 1 and early decision 2. You pump up the applicants there. Or you do what Northeastern does, which, you know, we have to give them like some award. They've mastered the art of gaming the yield system. You know, what one thing they'll do is, you know, when you're counting towards that acceptance rate, it's students who are accepted who will be enrolled on campus of that university for the incoming fall. So Northeastern, what they do is they send a lot of incoming freshmen and they say, well, you were accepted to an international campus for 1 semester, then you come back to Northeastern. Well, what does that accomplish for Northeastern? Those students don't count towards the acceptance rate. And therefore, that's how Northeastern University, right? And, you know, a couple people like had to blink a couple times, right? That's how Northeastern in Boston got to have the same acceptance rate 2 years ago as Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, right? Which would have been a mind-blowing, you know, fact.
Right. And I certainly didn't mean to imply that it's easier to get off a wait list at any given time. The fact is, wait lists change from school to school and from year to year. I've seen a trend over the last couple of years that the wait lists have been longer and that more and more schools are taking more and more students from wait lists. Yeah. But that says nothing about any individual student.
Well, Sigus, years ago, right? If you had a student, you were working with a student, at most, maybe they got waitlisted like once, right?
Once or
Maybe
twice.
twice.
Yeah. Mhm.
Right. I mean, now we have students, I will actually say it slowed down a little bit this year and came back, but I would say 2 years ago, peak pandemic, waitlist, routinely, there'd be 5, 6, 7 waitlists for a given student. And it
Yes.
was mind-numbingly frustrating. And at that point, they could have heard any time in April, May, June, July. Still to this day, the craziest story, and this happened peak pandemic, was a kid who was sitting at his graduation rehearsal and got off 2 wait lists within the same hour while he's sitting there. It was like, this is what was recent. I think it's just notable to bridge to the next section that some of these things still exist today. It's important to understand the history. The COVID supplement, or years later, that is still on the Common App this coming year. And it was last year too. It's a 250-word section that use this space to say how the pandemic impacted you. Then there was the introduction of DEI essay prompts, which it was interesting that Jim Sigas and I, when we were putting together these slides, it was like, wait, can we call them that? Right? Like, what, especially with affirmative action decision, which we're going to get to shortly. But it was exactly what they were at this time. Some prompts like Lehigh's and Tufts explicitly asked about DEI and where you are on your journey with equality, equity, and inclusivity and diversity. This, and especially in the wake of George Floyd, these prompts became more and more popular. I would not say prominent, but certainly numerous. And then, Jim, if you want to bridge this to the next section, virtual school, noisier grades, definitely one way of putting it.
Yeah, exactly. One final thing on yield as well. I didn't want to interrupt anyone, but it is important to also know that yield became harder for colleges to predict, especially with a lot of the strongest students applying to more schools than ever, along with everyone else. So one of the common, things we would hear is, a student at my school was accepted to, name an Ivy League school, but denied at name a state school. And they're like, what's going on here? And that's another way a college might try to protect their yield, to assume, well, this student is probably not actually interested in coming here, and doing a sort of preemptive denial based on that. In terms of virtual school and noisier grades, a lot of high schools adopted a policy during the pandemic that a student's grade couldn't go down when school turned virtual. It could only go up. And this was high schools doing their best, because who knows what a student's home situation is? Do they even have access to a computer regularly? Or are we in a household where we have 4 siblings trying to use the same family computer to do school? Right. So teachers felt, we shouldn't be penalizing students for their access to the technology to be able to participate in school. That all makes sense. However, it led to a situation where grades became even more highly inflated than they already were. What I have here is the percentage of college freshmen year over year who had an average of 90% or better in high school. And we can see that in the 60s, this was in the 20% range. In 2019, the last year before the pandemic, 68.1%. There was over a 20% spike in the percentage of students who left high school with a 90% plus average during that pandemic period, from 2019 to 2022. The study didn't even include the data from 2020 and 2021 because it was so exceptional. However, it's still part of the GPAs they're using in 2022. So the important thing to know here is just that, at the same time that colleges went test optional, grades also began to give them a less clear picture of a student's academic preparedness than ever before. And this left colleges in a very kind of confused situation, because at this point they were very genuinely test optional, but at the same time they weren't, quite able to suss things out using grades alone as well as they could in the past. And that brings us to the next phase here, finding equilibrium. And we saw a couple trends start to emerge in this post-pandemic period as people were adjusting to, changing circumstances. The first of which were the number of parents who said to the three of us, it just feels like it's a crapshoot now. And the fact that people in our profession had switched to, as Eric alluded to earlier, not just talking about target, reach, and likely schools, but a category beyond reach called lottery schools, which was necessary for those schools that have, single digit, sometimes sub 5% acceptance rates. So
I guess, do you want to interject on that point?
Yes. From having been in admissions work, I have to say that I resent the term lottery because it essentially negates what some really dedicated people have been doing for most of their lives. Individuals who are highly advanced in math understand a process called factor analysis. And I'm not going to try to explain that, but basically what that means is that here's a set of variables. And even though these variables are well defined, they might have different levels of importance for each person. These go into the box called college admissions. And on the other side of the box are another 15 to 20 variables that are placed in there by the college. And these too may have different levels of importance for each different college. When you throw that all in together, it may be that a student that you're looking at and you thought, well, this kid should have been a sure shot for X university who didn't get in. It may well have been that some of their variables were not what the college valued, or some of the college's variables were not what. It's not a lottery. It certainly may seem that way. And certainly if you don't get in, it clearly seems that way. But if we could deconstruct that black box, and don't even try, you'll never find out. You'll never find out. I worked at the college to which I was admitted. I thought, I'm going to find out why they actually admitted me. Nope. Couldn't even find that out at my own place to do. We'll never know that. We can just do our best to present ourselves in a genuine, transparent, and fearless way, and let the black box see what works.
Now I'm going to be the one that probably talks about wait lists more than I anticipated tonight. But I think just to build off that point, I was having a conversation with a family the other day. They were trying to understand wait lists. And when you hear the term wait list, it makes it sound like there's a literal list, right? First student off, number 1, Jim Wismer. Number 2, Eric Carlin. Number 3, Sig Hispani. And they asked me.
I'm third, thanks a lot.
I mean, just at least on my screen, you're the third one.
Okay.
Sorry, it's not you. You're number 1 in my books, I guess, every day. So,
Thanks, Eric.
Yeah, nothing personal, Jim, but he is the college fairy. So, but they said to me, they said, how is it possible we don't believe that there's not an actual list, right? Like, how is that possible? Then how do they choose which students get off? And I said, to Sigiz's point, I know this was a phrase used. It's becoming a bit more mainstream and well-known now, but it's institutional priorities, right?
Yes.
So
yes.
When we're talking about yield and we're talking about students coming in, right? Let's say Jim, now you can be my favorite again. You were the original number 1 on my list. Let's say that Jim overall is the number 1 person. He should be the person coming off the list first, in theory, right? However, the orchestra needs an oboe player. And the one student they took for oboe, because the orchestra's oboist at that university is a senior and graduating. And the one oboist that they took for the incoming freshman class decided, you know what? I'm going somewhere else instead. Guess what? The orchestra needs an oboe. First person coming off the wait list, gonna be the oboe player, right? Or take my alma mater, Penn, where, true story, when I was at my accepted students day, I remember the dean of admissions at the time standing in front of the entire auditorium and saying, tomorrow I'm flying to Wyoming to help convince the student we took from Wyoming to come to Penn, because if they don't accept, then your class won't be represented by all 50 states. And everyone in the auditorium like laughed and whatever. I was thinking about it. I'm like, seriously? Some kid in Wyoming is going to get wined and dined, right? While there's other kids that are on the wait list. And what happens if that kid from Wyoming doesn't choose to come? Then guess who's the next off the wait list? Probably another kid from Wyoming, right? Over Jim. So I think it's just really important to understand, and I know this is going to be a weird, very, very warm, holistic way of, phrasing it after what sounds like a cynical little bit. But the idea is that these college classes are very thoughtfully and intentionally and methodically put together. I know Sigis uses the analogy of a quilt sometimes, but there's so much thought being put into it that while the optics and the emotions may lead people to say words like crapshoot and lottery, it's so important for us, but I would encourage parents with your own children and in conversations with each other, you gotta push back on this narrative, right? It may not have worked out in your favor, but that doesn't mean that your child did anything wrong, right? It's like any human romantic relationship too. You can be perfect on paper for another person, and that doesn't mean that you're going to get married or that marriage will work out if you do get married, right? So, in fact, to that point, one thing I always talk about with transfer students is that the students who I work most often with on transfers are not students who got into struck out and ended up at a likely school. It's actually students who got into their early decision school and realized once they got there, wait a second, this didn't work out the way I thought it was going to. So, I think as we talk about the present state of admissions, it's so important that when you guys are hearing us, this is how we feel and what we know. These admissions officers are extremely intentional. Could be frustrating, could be mysterious, doesn't mean it's random.
Well said.
Absolutely.
So to move to some of the other trends that we saw in this kind of post-pandemic equilibrium period, first we saw mental health become solidified as a potential application component, where more students were, speaking about mental health, especially in that COVID section of an application, where that pandemic period was very hard on a lot of students, and in other places as well. Eric, do you want to expand on that?
It became something that all of a sudden was invited to be spoken about and articulated on the applications, and not just in the additional information section, which for those of you who've not gone through it before, the additional information section is a 650 word space on the Common App. So this goes to every school. It's basically like, if you haven't included something that you need to on the application, please do so here.
Here, right.
And traditionally, and I would say in like more extreme circumstances, and I use that word very lightly, was the only time it had to be out of the mentality of necessity to write a paragraph or two on a mental health struggle. And that was where you did it. You did not write about it in your essays. That was off limits completely. That was taboo. You were going to be judged, right? As the admissions officer going to look at you and say, you're not a fit here. You're not going to thrive here. So it was like a last desperate attempt to contextualize something. It was the only time. Now you could put it in the additional information section. The COVID section certainly invited it, but even in the essays themselves, whether you were writing a supplement essay on why you want to study psychology and how your own mental health struggles contributed to that, whether you were writing a community-centric essay and how you were part of a community of people who were struggling with maybe, let's say, anxiety, or the personal statement, that main Common App essay itself. This was not taboo. It became something you could talk about, and it followed the same rule as any other topic. If there's 100 essays on mental health, how is yours standing out from the pack in a way that we've really connected with you specifically and personally? So it was great that that was shattered, that taboo was eradicated, and students could articulate it. We could go off into a whole separate side rant, and perhaps we will later, about how test optional and increased pressure and mysteriousness around the admissions process and increased deferrals and waitlists then increased students' mental health, and the college is contributing to that. But at the very least, they did not make students feel like they could not fully represent themselves and share who they were. And the other pivot, on the point of essays, before I know Jim's going to get excited about test optional again and the continued evolution of it, and this was the key, right? And I alluded to this a moment ago, the shift from DEI essays to identity essays in the wake of the affirmative action decision. And I think it's worth noting that parents are always asking, what changed this past year? Like, what did you see change? What were the big changes in your job? And I've now done this 14 years, right? We founded the company in 2010. It's been a long time. And year after year after year, even when the SAT changed the first time, even during COVID, and it's, all the changes with that, I kind of would sit there when people asked me this, and I was like, still fundamentally the same thing, right? There's still really only 5 things in your control: your grades and rigor, your standardized test scores, your activities, your recommendation letters, and then the essays and applications themselves. I'm like, it's kind of it, right? Like, that hasn't changed. And I didn't feel any fundamental shifts. There was no, especially focusing more on the essay side of things, I wasn't seeing any dramatic changes, right? Even COVID didn't change the prompts. They just added a COVID writing blurb. The affirmative action decision was the first time where I felt like, not that my job changed, but that something radical did change, because so many schools changed their essay prompts last year. And that's bringing us, now we're getting to present day, right? But when that decision was announced last summer, schools that had released their prompts changed them. Schools had, in anticipation of this prompt, had already changed them in some cases, or they waited to release them until the decision was made so that they could write a new prompt. Because while you can't accept an applicant on the basis of their any facet of their identity, in the Justice Roberts's words, paraphrasing here, right? But you could talk about your race and identity and other factors like that in the context of your lived experiences. And that's what we saw in prompts. Instead of talking about DEI, now the prompts were focused around the idea of, tell us about a piece of your background or lived tell us a piece of your background, your perspectives, or lived experiences, how they have shaped you, and how they will shape how you will contribute to our community. And I do want to say one thing, and just it came up in conversation today with the essay team. I just want to, it was an interesting point in reflection on this past year, where I know, and our results showed it, like, we really thrived in supporting students with this prompt authentically. And I think so many students and parents, the knee-jerk reaction, and counselors and teachers, mind you, they saw this as a diversity essay rather than a lived experience and identity essay, which really is what it evolved into. And everyone rushed and assumed, well, I have to speak about my race or my ethnicity or my religion. These are the only things I can talk about. They overlooked that phrase, lived experience. They overlooked that you could have drawn from so many places from it. And people felt frustrated. People said, look, I'm writing an essay that feels like a familiar narrative that everyone's read before, or, this feels, pardon my French, this feels like bullshit, right? I'm writing about something that doesn't feel authentic. And, I think that at the end of the day, it underscored what we've always talked about. And I know, Sigis, you feel the same way, where it doesn't matter what the topic is. You could be talking about your race, you could be talking about an activity. You need to reflect on your individual experiences within that, right? If there's 100 essays, and I'm Jewish, right? So I'll use, Tikkun Olam, right? Like, healing the world. A lot of Jewish students will write about this idea. You can have 100 students write about Tikkun Olam, but just like everything else, you need to write the essay where if there's 100 Tikkun Olam essays and they're all spread on the floor and no one's name is on it, someone who knows you and loves you should be able to read all 100 essays, pick it up, and know which one I wrote, right? And I think that these prompts, were just like any other prompts in some level. They were a call for students to self-reflect and find themselves. And I actually had a lot of fun working with students on these prompts. I'm hoping that they don't change them radically again this year, but we'll see, right? We don't know. The supplement essay prompts haven't been released en masse yet, so time will tell. But either colleges are going to say, look, we're going to keep them because this is the one way for us to still be able to consider your race indirectly. This is a loophole. This is why the shift in prompts happened, because it was like, hey, if you want to talk about your race or your ethnicity or your religion, this is your moment. This is your chance, right? Like screaming lights, right? Or, I'm wondering if admissions officers got frustrated by reading the same narratives over and over again, and if there's going to be a pivot or a massaging of the prompts. Time will tell, and I don't think we're here to speculate tonight, but at least at this moment in time, that's the evolution that happened. And it was a pretty significant one. Before we throw it back to Jim, do you want to add on to that, Sigis, at all?
No, well said. Well, absolutely well said. I too enjoyed it more than usual because once the students realized that they could be more genuine, that they could be more themselves, I think they enjoyed it a lot more.
Yeah. Some really cool essays, really insightful, and to students. I really didn't think that any of them were inauthentic once we got to the right topic. Just sometimes took more conversations and reflection, but that's okay. It's all part of it. And after that beautiful holistic bit for me and Sigis, Jim, you want to talk about test optional again?
Yeah, so what we saw with test
And the
optional,
beauty of test optional going away a little bit.
yeah, I have some more pretty pictures to share. But so we started to see in this period, test optional went from kind of a forced situation to, in 2021, even more, some states were keeping test centers open and others weren't. And that kind of general opening up kind of happened slowly and in different places at different rates. But by, 2023, pretty much anyone was able to take the test. Although I will say students in California are still kind of having trouble getting seats at tests. Contact me if you're a sophomore and we'll talk about making sure you get seats for junior year, to be honest. This link up here will book you a 15-minute call into my calendar. But what we saw is that test optional became a spectrum. So there are colleges that are what I call genuinely test optional, where they truly believe we can do just as good of a job evaluating an application with and without a test score. A lot of these are schools that were test optional before they were forced to be. And a lot of them are schools that took the opportunity of the pandemic to really lean into a test optional program like Temple, where about 30% of their students submit test scores. So they're a genuinely test optional school. However, at a lot of schools, test scores are practically required. I mean, Ohio State, 85% of students submit scores, admitted students, that is, or rather their freshman class, which is the closest we can get to knowing what their admitted students did. Though pretty much the whole Ivy League, some of whom have gone back to requiring test scores, were admitting over 75% of their class with test scores. Duke, Purdue before they went back to requiring it. So we started to see test optional meaning very different things in different places.
Right.
And why is that? I alluded to this earlier. Grades did not have the same descriptive power as before. And not only are we seeing grade inflation, what it really causes is grade compression, where, you know, grades are not going to be as predictive of college success because they don't differ as much from one student to the other. On the other hand, test scores are standardized. I'm using data here from the ACT because they haven't redesigned and recentered the test 3 times over this time period like College Board has. But ACT scores, they don't change very much year to year. And in fact, in recent times, due to learning loss from the pandemic, they've actually trended somewhat downward, average ACT scores. But they've kind of always been in this 19 to 21 band. And so the test score tells you the same thing in 1990 that it does in 2022. In 1990, we're talking about, you know, 37% of high school students have an A average. In 2022, it's over double. So grades are telling you much less than they did at that time. Test scores are telling you the exact same thing. And that's why we've seen so many schools, especially on the more selective end, going back to test strongly preferred and test required policies. There are still genuinely test optional colleges out there. You'll see the language on a lot of admission sites that says, you know, your application will not be harmed if you don't submit a test score, or it will in no way detract from your application. I like to use a basketball metaphor here, because you don't lose a basketball game because the refs took your points away. You lose a basketball game because the other team outscored you. And test scores are a similar way. If you're not using a test score to help yourself, there are other applicants who are. And they're scoring more points than you. That's a very simplistic way to look at it. As Sig has said, the decisions that these admissions officers are making are multifactorial and highly complex. But this is just one thing that can be in your favor, or it can be absent. And so you're not directly harming your application by omitting the test score. It's more of a missed opportunity. And that's what we saw over this period with basically every college that released data on their acceptance rates for students who submitted scores and who didn't, showing that they admitted the students who submitted scores at a higher rate.
So it's interesting, Jim. I'm hearing you say that. It's not like this is the first time we've talked about it. But I think during this period of time, that 2021, 2022, 2023, you know, I would often lament and commiserate with families that whether or not to submit a test score was a very data-driven decision, you know, and yet the colleges weren't releasing the data to help students make that decision. And I'm curious your response to this, but on one hand, I still feel like that's true on an individual basis, right? If you have a 1410 and you are looking at BY or NYU that inflated their average test scores in the wake of test optional, and you know, and you're looking at your grades, it seems to be this almost impossible calculus where it would be great to have some data on it. And yet, as I'm listening to you talk now, it's almost like, well, guys, like the data doesn't matter, right? Because overwhelmingly, the schools that did release, and now in retrospect, as we're learning more and more, test optional in many places was probably a myth, right? Overwhelmingly, students with test scores got in versus those who didn't. Are both of these things true at the same time, or like, what's your assessment of that?
So it is a very complicated decision, because you can't say that just because the students who submitted test scores were admitted at a higher rate, you should then submit your test score. It's really, because it's in many ways a subjective decision based on your overall application. And based on the university, I had a friend who's in the industry. He toured Auburn, large state school in the South. They asked a question at the admissions officer presentation. Hey, you guys say you're test optional. Your numbers don't really show that you're test optional. And the admissions officer, I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially admitted we're test optional for rural Alabama valedictorians because we are a state school serving the students of Alabama. And these students who are the top of their class at these under-resourced schools in the middle of nowhere, Alabama, deserve a chance to come and try, even though their school didn't prepare them for the skills that are tested on the SAT and ACT, the way that the students in the Atlanta suburbs were able to prepare for those. Very fair, very fair, and Auburn should keep that policy. Their mission is to serve the students of Alabama, and that's a way for them to do it, right? So if you're applying to Auburn, submit your test score unless you really can't. But it varies so much school to school that it's really hard to generalize, and student to student, for the explanatory power it would add to your application. One thing we saw a lot, I would say one of the buzzwords of 2024 is miswithholding. Miswithholding being students who held back test scores that would have helped them be admitted. This is something that Dartmouth talked about with their return to requiring test scores, that they actually, when they went back and retrieved data on students who applied without test scores, they found that there would have been many students who would have fared better had they included the test score. And so this is it's a situation where I think, you know, the kind of default advice that everyone went to in the test optional world, us included, because everyone was figuring it out as we went, was, oh, if you're above the median, submit the score. If you're below the median, withhold it. And that was kind of phase one of test optional advising. The thing is, the medians are now inflated, as I referenced earlier, because the lowest scores dropped out. So the median isn't the median anymore. And so to me, you should pretty much always submit if you're between that median and 25th percentile score. Unless you're applying to one of the known rankings chaser schools like Northeastern, then it's more of a conversation. So there are just so many ifs, ands, and buts with the whole thing. But generally speaking, you have to understand that an SAT score of 1400 tells Dartmouth, I will show up at Dartmouth and actually be able to do the work here. Whereas if you applied with an SAT score of 1100, based on their data, they might say, this is a student that is has a pretty high likelihood to not be able to do the work here, to fail out, not do their best on campus. So, you know, students should not be withholding 1400s from Dartmouth, because that is proof that you can hang. Now, if peers in your patch of the quilt, to use Siggis's metaphor, meaning students from a similar background to you, similar education, similar schools, and things like that, are submitting higher test scores than that, yeah, it'd be better if you submitted a 1550. But the 1400 is probably better than the nothing, because these colleges aren't dummies. They know that when they don't get a test score, it's on the lower end of what they could expect, because if it was on the higher end, it would have been included.
But in fairness, Jim, you know, if that was exclusively the case, then there would be no term miswithholding, right? And what I think, and I'm sick as I'm sure you saw this too. And look, I hate to generalize. I think it was at a lot of high schools, but especially private and independent high schools, some of the anecdotes that were coming back with students who were high flyers were truly staggering. The message that was being said to them, right? It was, you know, you scored a 34, but we would go test and the counselors are saying you should go test optional unless you get a 35 or 36. And it's interesting if you look back at the history, you know, and that's why we contextualized all of tonight with the history that we did. Test scores were never a distinguishing factor, right? And this is why I know that there is a question in the Q&A. And the question is that, you know, I've heard admissions officers say that they could just as easily have admitted an entirely different group of students, you know, instead of the applicants that were accepted, and that they could have multiple times over have just as good of a class. right? But just as good of a class, what does that mean? Well, what that means is the same average GPA and the same average SAT and ACT, right? So really, while the nuances and everything of what Jim said and the breakdown of grade inflation and really illuminating so clearly why the trend towards test requirement makes so much sense today in our new normal, grades and test scores were never distinguishing factors. I remember speaking with a prospective family years ago, and they didn't have summer plans. The activities were very weak. There were other things, but they were hung up on, they said, well, we have a 1540 SAT, and we know that if we get into a 1570, we'll get into Yale. I'm like, that's not how it works, even if you had strong activities and strong everything else, right? Like, that extra 30 points is not make or breaking you. Would I like the extra 30 points? Sure, that's nice, right? It's not going to hurt you to increase your score. But that idea that would have been distinguishing those extra 20, 30 points was, even back then, misguided. So and it just underscores and Sigis, I know you answered the question, right? It's like, when we talk about that just as good, right? What that means, it's once you get past the test optional, and versus submitting the test scores, the distinguishing factors are, the activities, the recommendation letters, the essays, and then all the other intangibles that are out of your control.
Let me circle back just for a couple minutes to grades and grades inflation, and then we go on. It seems like among most of the families and students that apply to the more selected schools, there are now 3 grades in high school: A, expected; B, disappointing; and C, failure. Now, this has crept into the perception of performance on the advanced placement exams. AP runs a scale from 1 to 5. 5 is an A, 4 is a B, 3 is a C. First of all, the National Association for College Admissions Counseling does a survey every year called the State of College Admissions. They give college admissions officers 16 different qualities, criterias, requirements, and asks them to rank them. So number 1 typically is rigor, number 2 is great. What's number 16? AP and IB scores. Okay. Secondly, there are 10th graders that take AP tests. An AP exam is designed to be the equivalent of a 1-semester introductory college class. Okay. It's a 13th grade course. This student is taking it in 10th grade and gets a 3. That's a C. How many millions of actual 13th graders are taking college courses and getting C's? Okay, no more rant. We'll go on.
It's a well taken point, though. Before I know Jim's probably excited to talk about the more specific trends and that tests are becoming less optional this year. But I think that echoes the point I started with a moment ago. It's just the message that we're sending to students. It's especially for us as educators and doing what we do for so long. It's really frustrating. Like, when you really just take a step back, like, can you imagine telling a 16, 17-year-old that a 34 is not good enough on the ACT out of 36? I mean, the message being sent in some, different forms, it's really frustrating. And these teenagers, again, Sigis, you've done it longer, but even in my shorter career of 14 years, right? It's the students today are working way harder and doing way more and have way more pressure on them than a decade ago, and way more than 2 decades ago. And we got to have some empathy for them and help them to not lose that perspective on how incredible many of their achievements are. And so anyways, that's a whole separate point. Jim, bring us back.
Okay.
Where are we with tests this year?
So in terms of tests this year, we've seen several schools go back to requiring tests just this spring. Yale, Dartmouth, Brown, Harvard, University of Texas are the kind of big names recently. And, you know, when we say tests are becoming less optional, part of that is these colleges going back to requiring them. But the other part of it is that they're less optional where they are optional in many cases as well.
Anyway, right.
Yeah, so that's just something to keep in mind. We've kind of already beat the point to death of how difficult it is to actually make the decision. The one shameless plug I'll put in here is I will help you with it if you work with us on test prep. I'm happy to have that conversation with any family who does test prep with us. Fall of senior year, you send me a college list, you send me a GPA and a test score. I may have some follow-up questions for you, and I'll give you the best advice that I can. We do it for all of our essay students as well. And a lot of times, if you ask your essay coach, they're going to talk to me about it, Eric included sometimes when we have tricky situations, you know, when we want to bounce ideas off of each other. So, you know, unfortunately, it seems to be the kind of decision that you almost need a professional to help you make. Although I will say, even we are acting with a fair amount of uncertainty in a lot of these borderline situations. There are things that are obvious to us, and there are things that are murky. But we'll be at least transparent with you when we say this is a no-brainer strong recommendation, or I think based on what I'm seeing that this should be the case. So I don't want to beat it to death too much in terms of generalities, but I will just say in general, the tests are less optional. Every student's plan A should pretty much be to test unless they have some pretty serious challenges in the testing space. If you think that may be you, again, you know, I will speak to any family about what their prospective test prep plan should be. So feel free to use the QR code to book a call with me.
And one thing, you know, just to chime in here is to acknowledge the new digital SAT. And the, you know, and just saying that the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? Especially if you're a parent of a younger student listening to this, there's going to be some temptation for students to say, well, that digital test is shorter. It doesn't have that science section like the ACT does, you know, it's on the computer. We're going to default to that, right? And write off the ACT completely. And I cannot emphasize this strongly enough, you know, no matter what happens, you know, this year and future years, as long as there's more than one option for tests, take a diagnostic of both to see which one you're better at. Because you can stereotype as much as you want and try to oversimplify it. But even years ago, when I was going through the process, right, I was more of a writery person than a math person. I really had a good vocabulary. I really loved puzzles and riddles and stuff. Everything would have said I'm better suited for the SAT. And, you know, I struggled on the SAT and practice tests. And then lo and behold, I took practice ACT, and defying logic, I scored close to perfect on my first practice tests, and, you know, it was done quickly. And my point here is just, I know there's a lot of chatter about the digital SAT, especially after the March test, where, you know, that's a whole separate commentary, Jim. If you want to get into that at all, I think that's more your space. But I think that people are automatically defaulting to it or straying away from it. And it's like, just don't generalize. Every individual is going to be different. Figure out what test is best for you at the onset, then choose, because, you know, and don't default to test optional. At least you owe it to yourself to take diagnostics to figure out where your starting place is, how much work you would need to do. It's just whether it's choosing between the tests, choosing to take them at all and prepare for them, you owe that bit of energy to yourself, students, parents. You know, make your kids sit down and do the diagnostics. It's
More
essential.
better, more
To me, it's
options you can
essential.
give yourself. Absolutely.
Exactly. It's a measure twice, cut once kind of situation, because if you just prep and prep and prep for the digital SAT and it doesn't work out, well, I'm working with some junior families now who, the student just wanted to do the digital SAT because they just like the format better. They did their own thing for prep for months to try to get ready for that digital SAT. It didn't work out. They reached back out to me like, hey, you're the guy who told us we should try to take an ACT. Can we still do that? And now they're prepping for an ACT. Well, you could have only prepped for one test if you find that information out at the beginning. So it seems like a lot of time to take the 2 practice tests. It's more time to prep for 2 tests, I promise. So you're saving yourself time in the long run. I will say, generally speaking, in terms of the digital SAT rollout, what we saw was that the March SAT was significantly more difficult than the Blue Book practice tests that College Board has made available. So my flippant comment about this would be, if you're going to default to a test without diagnostics, I'd recommend defaulting to the ACT, because they release 3 practice tests to us every year and have since time immemorial. We have in our Google Drive all the ones back to 2008, but there are more from before that too. And so that's a test that we know intimately well. The digital SAT, for a long time, there were only 4 practice tests that College Board released. So we had that and their curriculum guide for the test. And I've spent the better part of the last 2 years of my life preparing for this digital SAT. So we have studied those tests every which way possible. And still, then they pull this situation in March where the March test was, by universal student report, much more difficult than the Blue Book practice tests, especially in the harder level math questions. So if you want to default to a test without doing diagnostics, the smart way to be lazy would be to go ACT, not to go SAT, even though the quality of life upgrades of shorter tests taken on a screen might kind of tempt you to the SAT.
I think it's worth noting, whether it's us or any group, right? There's the fundamental difference between being an expert in something and being an expert something as much as possible given the circumstances. That's a pretty distinct, that's a pretty important distinction. We haven't had this before. Someone's raising their hand. Do we want to do that, or should we save all questions for
We'll save all questions, drop them in the Q&A feature, and we'll cover all the questions at the end.
Yeah.
The other thing I'll say about the digital SAT that's worth saying, and if you if you attended our digital SAT webinar, then you would know this. There are 90 questions that count on the digital SAT. There are 215 questions that count on an ACT. So on average, a digital SAT question has more than twice the power to affect your score as an ACT question does. On top of that, digital SAT, because it's adaptive, questions can have different weights. You can miss a question and it could take 0 points from your score. You could miss a question and we've seen it take up to 40 points from a score. Most of them are going to be 10 or 20. That's more normal. But the point is, the digital SAT is, by its very design features, a higher variance test than the ACT, because it's a smaller sample size of questions and there can be bigger swings from one question to the next. So what that functionally means is that a student's range of outcomes on the digital SAT is wider when they take the official test than it is on the SAT. So if your true ability level is a 1400, then maybe that means you can score anywhere from 1250 to 1550 on a digital SAT. Whereas if your true score was a 32 on the ACT, you're going to expect to be in like a 30 to 32 range, which is like a 50 SAT point range, to put it in SAT terms for our people who are more familiar with that test. So you're just going to see bigger swings on this digital SAT. So the other piece of advice I'd give to anyone is, if digital SAT is your test, you're taking it more than once. Plan to take it more than once up front. We recommend that for ACT students as well, especially for super scoring purposes, just because it's unlikely you'll do your very best in all the sections of the test on one day. But for the digital SAT, it's going to be even more important to test multiple times. And then if you end up, getting that high roll on the first test and you don't have to test again, awesome, good for you. Congratulations, take it to the bank. But that shouldn't be your plan.
So,
So let's try.
pivoting out of that.
Yeah.
What were we gonna say?
I said, let's transition out of testing.
Yeah. So I was gonna say, so there was an article that came out recently that went by all standards in college admissions and high school parents circles, pretty viral. I believe it was in the New Yorker, about how this past year was the craziest year in admissions ever, which I feel like, by the way, that headline could be written every year by
It's
someone.
like the NFL.
Yeah.
The NFL season's the craziest season ever. Can you believe what just happened? Like, I kind of can, because something like that happens every year.
Yeah. So Sigus, we'll give you the floor first. Was this past year the craziest year ever in college admissions?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I believe this is cumulative over the years, because you look at all these trends of more and more people applying and fewer certainties about it. And then to drop all the way down where it says protectionism in flagship state schools, there's a wonderful saying that a rising tide floats all boats. Well, you take that and you add to that the protectionism that many state governors are choosing these days, who are now getting pressures from their citizens and from their legislatures. Hey, this is our state university. We should have priority attending our own state universities. And so you've seen in the last dozen years or so, a number of states, Florida and Georgia are among the most notable, that have specific scholarships for state residents to attend state-supported schools. So you see this, and then just to look at some of the trends for this year, Michigan is now Yale. Well, okay, then what's the new Michigan? Wisconsin. What's the new Wisconsin? Indiana. What's new Indiana? Tennessee. So you see how these schools have risen. Also, I know that among my cohort of students with whom I work, I'm in southeastern Pennsylvania, but I do have a number of students from around the country online. Seems like everybody wants to go to warm climates these days. So those schools have risen in popularity for it to go. So you take that in as well, where Michigan received over 100,000 applications this year. And you throw in what we've been talking about with even the colleges themselves trying to figure out, oh, what do we do for yield now that we're getting a zillion more applications? Toss that in with the FAFSA fiasco this year. Thankfully, we don't have much more time, because that would turn into a complete rant on my part. So, but yes, it is the craziest year ever. It's probably the least predictable, which doesn't mean it's a lottery, which doesn't mean it's just throw it up there and see what fits. It doesn't mean that. It means that maybe you need to take a little bit more time researching the schools where you want to apply, determining what pathway you want to take, what tests you want to take, how you present yourself to that school, and then say to yourself, I've been the big three: genuine, transparent, and fearless. I've put myself out there, and if they take me, okay, I'm good. Don't fall for the early decision lie. Oh my gosh, it's a 4 times better chance of getting into school X if I apply early decision. Well, a brief math lesson. There's 2 types of maths. There's linear math, which compares individuals or integers. And there's discrete math, which compares sets and groups. That number, 4 times better chance, is applied to the set of people that apply. So if I decide to apply to the University of Pennsylvania on an early decision, and they accepted 22% last year as opposed to the 5.4% on regular, I have a 430% chance better of no. That set has a 430% chance of getting in, not me as an integer as part of that. I mean, frankly, if I had a 2.2 GPA and an 820 SAT, I'd still have a 430% chance, better chance of getting in as a member of that set. But as an individual, I don't have a chance in the world. Early decision helps you by telling the college that you are the first choice. We love you, college. It's the best way to tell a college that. So do you get some consent? Yes, of course you get something of a bump. But to go back to the quilt analogy that I love, the quilt starts with the earlies. And among the people with whom you're competing for early decision are the predominant number of athletes, the predominant number of legacies, the parents who can give millions of dollars and you can't, and all the special groups that the college is looking to attract, international students, first generation students, whatever they might be. The college is certainly going to bring them in as quickly as they would like, because then they provide the foundation for the first year class. So apply early decision, not because it's a strategy. That's a really slippery slope for life anyway, by the way, but because it's the right thing for you to do.
Yeah. And to just to build off that, right? Like, it's interesting that there's still, and it's an emotional myth that if you don't apply early decision, and well, I guess if you do apply early decision and then you aren't accepted early decision, then it's like, oh my goodness, like I have no shot anywhere else, right? It's like, well, if that was the case, then the vast majority of students wouldn't be going to college every year, right? And
Right.
from top to bottom, no matter what the acceptance rate of a school, I mean, we had students accepted regular decision, at least one at every school. And that's, and it was different, even at the tippy top, it was different students at each school, right? Which underscores that quilt metaphor. And institutional priorities vary school to school. They're looking for different kids. It's really like a marriage between the two. Before we get into the Q&A, I want to offer a tempered rebuttal, right? And I think it's appropriate that we're ending the night on this question of is this the craziest year ever, right? Because this is talking about the new normal. This is talking about the state of admissions right now. And it's interesting, when I asked you, Sigis, you said yes, right? And I agree with you. And yet at the same time, I don't, because I think when we use a term like crazy, it needs to be used gently. And to say that this is the craziest year ever, I think insinuates falsely that there's some fundamental overall shift. And to go back to your tides and ships metaphor, where it's not that every single university is undergoing some dramatic change, right? You have to look year to year and individual school to individual school, right? And I think to your point, I think you raised an excellent point with from the in-state perspective about protectionism at those big state schools, right? But the flip side, if you look from the outside in, these are the schools that are the hottest schools in the country now, because
yes,
they have it all. They have money and resources and academics and national and international networks and sports, right? And all the sports. Although let's be honest, anytime someone's like, I want rah-rah, I'm like, it's football, right? Like, it's not, no one's going for basketball, right? It's all football. And I keep trying to tell students, like, you're literally going for 5 home games, right? Like, come on, you got to choose for other reasons for that. But neither here nor there. So from the inside and the outside, these are the schools. I think the trend, if we're talking about getting crazier than ever, it's the state schools that are getting the most crazier than ever, at least at this moment in time. And you have to be careful, because a lot of families and students, when they're looking at acceptance rates, they get a sense of false hope, because they see the admissions numbers and they're not nuancing in-state versus out-of-state admissions.
Amen.
And that is a very, very dangerous mistake to make when you are trying to build not a well-balanced list, which I have my own thoughts on that, but a responsible list for your student and family, right? And that's the public institutions. Then you have the private institutions. And I think, those are the two, especially putting a spotlight on the Tulanes, Northeasterns, Case Westerns, Miamis of the world. And my pushback to just saying yes, which, I mean, you're right, it is. But to generalize it, which wasn't what you were doing, Sigus, but a lot of people are. No, this wasn't the craziest year ever for Tulane or Northeastern or Case Western. That was years ago, right? The years when all of a sudden, the manipulation of yields was just so blatantly obvious. And what was it, 2 or 3 years ago, Tulane accepted fewer than 100 students regular decision because they had basically filled the class, early decision 1 and early decision 2. I mean, the crazy years at certain institutions are behind us. Now we've just settled into a new normal, which is crazier than it was 10 years ago. But you kind of go, I mean, look, if anything, Tulane reverted a little back this year, I think, to what it would have been pre-pandemic, right? It functioned like a little bit more like, oh, I see that, I get it.
Yeah.
Whereas I think that, I mean, look, these state schools, it's what everyone wants right now. I've joked often, like if, universities were stocks and I had money to invest in, like what schools were going to be fast rising, I'd be investing money in University of Colorado right now after they hired Deion Sanders as their coach. Ohio State, which has been overlooked for years, is in a great city in Columbus. South Carolina, Alabama. It's like families ask us all the time, like, what are hidden schools? And it's like, it's the schools that have been in front of your face all the time that you overlooked. And now it's like, well, I want a football school in the South, right? Warm weather with, great business programs and et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, well, there's options there. And people are realizing that now. And rising tide, boats are going up, So yeah, it's gonna get crazier.
Yeah,
But
I think
really,
the protectionism issues at the flagship state schools are probably exacerbated by the fact that state schools see surges in in-state applicants when economic forecasts or conditions are not as strong. And given all the inflation that we've seen, a whole lot of people are thinking in-state tuition sounds really good. And that makes it much more difficult for the out-of-state applicants if a state school gets a huge surge of in-state applicants.
yeah,
Indeed.
it's true.
The
I
only
wonder,
haven't covered on this slide that I think it's important for us to hit is this idea of, is it actually wise to apply to 15 plus schools? Because it's something that has steadily increased in popularity among the students we work with and what we hear from our colleagues. So Eric, what do you think?
no. See, now I'm just gonna give as simple of an answer as Sigus gave to, is it the craziest year ever? No, it is not. My two things I want to add on to this, and then Sigus gets last word before Q&A, is number one, if you're applying to more than 15 schools, the quality of your product is going down. And quite frankly, I can't speak as beautifully and poetically and accurately as Sigus can about the different types of math, right? But everyone thinks that if they apply to more than 15 schools, they're giving themselves more options. But by that logic, the effort that you're putting forth is equal for all of those schools, and it's just as high quality and good. When you're on average at the types of schools that I think everyone here is looking for and thinking about overwhelmingly, and I'm not talking about the top 20 or top 50, I'm talking like the top 200, colleges and universities, the average application load is you have about, on average, one school-specific supplement essay per college that you're applying to. So if you're applying to more than 15 schools, you're doing the main Common App essay, any other written components of that, plus now more than 15 other additional essays. I'm sorry, between sleep, social life, eating, school, homework, extracurricular, summer programs, and everything else, and learning TikTok dances, the quality of product is just going to go down. And that's something that we've observed, at least among our students, is that when students are applying to more than 15 schools, their results end up underperforming versus overperforming. This isn't a secret. I've said this to families. I've begged them. I've said, you gotta be smart and strategic. You gotta put forth a quality application, because we can work together and we can put together the highest quality of work given the time constraints you have. But if you're applying to 20 schools, I'm sorry, right? Like, that's not strategic. The other thing I would say, and I was just going to say this before you started referencing this one point, Jim, and to the point of money, one expression I have a lot is like, don't make something an option that's actually an option, or that's not actually an option. Don't make something an option that's not actually an option. Guys, it's really nice, the idea of applying to prestigious brand name, pretty bumper sticker schools. But I'm seeing it more than ever, to Jim's point, with inflation and, financial responsibilities. Students are getting in to these schools. It's not that they're not getting in, they're getting in. And it's only after the acceptance letters come in when families are going, wait a second, hang on, hold on. We're going to go into way more debt for that school versus our state school or some other place that's not as highly ranked or, highly rejected or prestigious, but you got an honors college and thousands of dollars of merit money, and it's way cheaper. And I'm seeing it more than ever. And I just wish families had these conversations more upfront. Parents with their children, understanding the financial investment, saying, is it worth it to apply to this school? Are we ever really going to consider it? But, given the context of where you're applying likely and what that is. And this is how we have students right now debating, let's just keep it vague, right? A Wash U or pick a state in the lower southeast of the United States that their flagship university, the Honors College, basically free tuition. Or, a student in the Mid-Atlantic choosing between their flagship public universities and an Ivy League institution. These are real conversations now. And it's a shame that, wow, you went through all that work and effort and expended that energy and stress. Let's be strategic about building that list at the onset. It's nice to visit and apply to, pretty schools, and then reality sets in.
The final math test of college admissions is compound interest.
I guess you want to say something before Q&A?
I'll close out with two things. One, front load, don't back load. Do your research ahead of time on the colleges that are more suitable to you, front load, as opposed to getting to October, panicking and backloading, and then applying to 15 schools. And number two, always remember that the root of the word prestige is from a French Latin root, and it means trickery.
Well said.
Did you know that before or after the movie The Prestige came out?
Oh, I knew that way before. I took French and Latin in school.
There you go.
I'm
going to make a proposal, guys, because some of the questions we got, there's some shorter ones at the end. And I think, why don't we go in reverse order? Is that an acceptable proposal?
How many colleges do you recommend to apply to? 2 to 4 reach, 2 to 3 target, 1 to 3 likely.
I'm going to give a different perspective. Sigus and others may talk about a well-balanced list. think well-balanced lists are overrated. Apply to schools that genuinely are going to make you happy. Probably 8 to 10. Just make sure you have 2 or 3 likely schools on that list that also make you genuinely happy, and focus the conversations at home on finding 2 to 3 likely options that genuinely make you happy. Whether
That
you
too.
provide targets or reaches, I don't know. I don't care personally, but I think I'm in the vast minority on that, and that is a more nuanced
Well,
conversation.
and I'm saying that, Eric, with the assumption that you've done your research on those schools,
There.
that they are appropriate for you. Yes.
We didn't even get into how target schools are like a critically endangered species now, but that rant is for another time.
Right.
All right. With the increased popularity of state schools and warmer locations, are Northeast liberal arts schools getting less attention?
Sigas don't cry, but you can answer this. Well, you grab a tissue.
In general, yes. Of course, those that are considered the more high quality ones are doing fine, but a number of schools, I think of right here in our area, there were a number of small liberal arts colleges that essentially closed down in the last couple of years, and I see typically about one per month these days that comes across and is either having to shut down or merge with some other school and make it happen with that to do. I think in general, the small liberal arts colleges have sort of lost some of their appeal for a lot of people. Not a lot of my students are really keen about going to a school that's like, oh, that's smaller than my high school. Well, yes, your high school has 2,000 students, 1 building, and 3 acres, and everybody goes home at night. And X college has 2,000 students with 406 acres and 37 buildings, and no one goes home at night. So it's a little bit different. Just a little bit different.
Well said. And do we have any thoughts about hidden gems like Elon?
Yeah, they're amazing. I mean, there's a lot of hidden gems out there, and I would say, then the retort, I'm sure some families or students are thinking like, well, Elon doesn't have a football team. I mean, they do have a football team, right? But I think there's this mentality. What I'm trying to say is that hidden gems, you're giving something up, which is for what a lot of students want, which is that rah-rah sports scene, right? And I'd say 2 things. Number one, you really should evaluate how important that and essential that is to your college years, because there are amazing schools like one that like need to be given greater consideration. I can think, at least in terms of schools where our students were applying, Elon was getting really hot before the pandemic, and they were masterful. I think they rolled out like a literal red carpet when students visited, and they called you by your first name, and it like really, the value, people could see it when you visited, and then people weren't able to visit, and it got lost, in the pandemic years when people couldn't visit anymore. But the flip, so I think, yes, there's a lot of hidden gems like Elon. I think they're amazing schools. Students should be looking at them more. I think this goes to what Sigas is saying. There's just colleges that have been overlooked and eclipsed by, what's hot in the market right now. But look, even what's hot in the market right now, I think there's, again, I wouldn't call them hidden gems because they're in plain sight. I think the website that I use most often when I need a quick reference for helping a student with a college list is ESPN.com. You click on the NCAA tab, you click on teams, and it sorts by conference, which basically is sorting them geographically. And it's every school that has D1 football, right? I mean, it's right there. And even on that list, even on that webpage, I think there's a lot of colleges that people are just overlooking right now. Or they're seeing and they're turning their nose up at them, but like, wait for a couple years, it's going to be different. You're not going to be turning your nose up so quickly anymore. So that's my answer.
All right. And how do we find the acceptance rate for out-of-state students at state schools? So the colleges know this information, but they don't make it publicly available. You can sometimes email them. I've had a lot of success with Texas A&M. They have a really great data department, and they'll share anything. They gave me the average ACT score for an out-of-state student. This was years ago, so it would be out of date. Don't ask for it. But you can ask the school directly, and that's going to be your best source of information. Some of them might put it on their admissions blog or something like that, but there is no good way to consistently get this information.
This is sadly true. Or you could apply to states that have a smaller population that need out-of-state students. I think University of Delaware, for example, 35% of the students who attend Delaware are actually Delaware residents.
Right.
So you could sort of do it in reverse.
Yeah, and I believe UNC is by charter 82% North Carolina residents at Chapel
Yes.
Hill. So you can use those numbers as a sort of proxy for how different it will be, but you're not going to get clear data without asking for it directly. And sometimes if you ask for it directly, they say no.
And by the way, because this popped up, where do you go for acceptance data, broken down by major? I mean, that's
Same
that's
answer.
not- yeah, I mean, that's not even a thing. Maybe they'll tell you, and you're not even accounting for the fact that undecided is an option, and that would have its own acceptance rate too.
Yep. A question here. Can you talk about your bullet 5? Now, our bullet 5 was that subjective factors are becoming more important in admissions. We did kind of breeze past that on the last slide. So if you want to address it quickly, go for it.
Well, this is the black box model. This is the quilt model. This is here. As a student, I'm bringing these variables to the school. Here, as the college, I'm putting these variables from our perspective into the box, and let's see how it mixes. So it may be the example of the oboe player. It may be something like that. It may be that the school is looking to find a more wide population in a certain area. For example, there's been a big emphasis now on small town and rural students who had been neglected among a lot of, not neglected, but maybe not prioritized, let's say, among a lot of the more selective schools who are now getting their time, just like transfer students maybe 10 years ago got their spotlight finally to do that. So these are, I mean, at heart, these are subjective. These are not measurable in the typically analytic way. But that's what makes colleges different. Colleges are snowflakes, just like human beings, all different.
Do you want to quickly wrap off that with the recent question? Did we see any impacts of the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action in this admission cycle?
Well, yeah, we just saw a big one the other day. Duke University got rid of a scholarship that was specifically for Black individuals. So it's spreading. And some schools have said, no, this is just about admissions. But I believe that schools are now becoming, I think schools are being advised by their legal counsel to be aware that scholarships and other means by which their separation by race may not be supportable.
Yeah, and just to reiterate my point earlier, right? I think the biggest impact was on what you need to submit to the colleges themselves, right?
For
Like the
sure.
essay prompts. But I know that question, when we're being asked, is most often coming from a place of like who got in and who didn't. But I can't sit here in any way and say I saw anything fundamentally different.
All right. And then does early action tell the school the same thing as early decision, that you're my first choice? Does early action convey any advantage? I'll answer first by saying the most obvious advantage of early action is that you hear earlier from the school. You may be deferred, meaning they're going to wait to tell you until the regular decision notifications, but you have the possibility of knowing sooner. That's the primary benefit of early action. But Eric or Sigis, do you want to weigh in as well?
Smaller benefit than ED.
I would say significantly smaller at this point.
All right.
I want the next one.
Yeah.
How does generative AI impact how students should approach essays such that they are distinctive? Was watching a video the other day of let's just say an admissions officer at a very prestigious university, very prestigious, who number one pointed out something that feels like it should be more obvious, right? AI knows AI, we can run your essays through an AI detector to see if it was generated by AI and, you know, the statistical probability that it was, right? Like, there's pretty easy measures at this point to combat it. I can't project 10 years down the road. I would also, it's interesting how this question was asked, how students should approach essays such that they are distinctive, right? As if the generative AI is going to help make the students' essays distinctive.
Right.
It's not.
Doing exactly the opposite.
It's not. Just like, quite frankly, me writing the essay for a student, and I am a, you know, writer by study and trade, is not going to help a student write a more distinctive essay. You know, certainly not one that's authentic, right? And I tell this to students all the time. This isn't a writing contest. The best written essays are not the ones that are most widely reputed and, you know, rewarded in admissions offices. They're the essays that are the most personal and personally insightful. I tell every student, like, you're going to write the best version of your essay. No one else is, right? I may write something pretty, but it's not going to have the same detail and reflection. And that doesn't come from crisply written sentences or, you know, distinct vocabulary. Drives me crazy. It's like, should we change this word choice? I'm like, it's not, you know, it's that old expression. It's not what you say, it's how you make me feel, right? Generative AI makes me feel like I'm reading something generic, right? And impersonal. It could read beautifully, it, you know, but even this argument that, oh, AI is like a calculator, right? It's a tool that helps you get to the solution. I'm like, just use your authentic voice, right? I mean, from start to finish, I think the quality of product's better. And what was interesting was in another segment, another admissions officer was saying, look, you know, overwhelmingly students aren't using AI. And when we know they're using AI, it's the students who probably weren't going to get in anyways to the school. Like,
Yeah.
you know, again, I don't know what it's going to be like 10 years down the road, but at this moment in time, this coming year, you know, I had a student this past year call me freaking out, you know, all my friends are using AI. And I was like, well, I don't think that's going to help them at all. You know, it's not. These admissions they are not, you know, these admissions officers, no one likes being played and they are not dumb. They know. They know this is their living. They know a human from, you know, a computer.
Amen.
All right, so does a hot school or a ranking chaser, Northeastern, Clemson, Miami, for example, does the yield practice make them a lesser college to attend, academically a false ranking? So I think the heart of this question is basically, if we know that a college is trying to act in such a way to benefit their standing in the US News and World Report ranking, does that then cheapen their ranking? And the answer to this question is stop looking at those rankings. Because you're trying to make very specific decisions about what's going to be a good fit for you. And the US News and World Report is not going to help you do that.
I just want to build off. A question came in after my generative AI answer. I listened to a webinar with several admissions officers recently, and they acknowledged that they don't even have time to review essays to see if they were written by AI. Okay, let's focus on what they're not saying. Just because they don't have time to review it, at least this group of admissions officers, doesn't mean that they need to review it. They may know anyways. One of them even said you could use AI for ideas and then rewrite it. Again, that's acknowledging a truth. You can do that. It doesn't mean it's the right decision or it's going to ultimately lead to the best product, right? It's like test optional. If you ask an admissions officer, will it hurt me if I don't submit my test scores? And they're going to say it will not hurt you. But to Jim's analogy earlier, it will not help you. So, you know, don't just listen in general to what people are saying, listen to what they're not saying.
Well said. All right. Is no test score from an affluent prep school student indicative enough to an admissions officer of the score being low that an honest reporting of a lower end score in a school's range is a better approach, because at least it shows the student's transparent ability? So I would say, generally speaking, if you're in the college's middle 50%, you should be submitting the score. You need a reason, a very strong reason not to submit it if you're in the middle 50%, whether you're attending an affluent prep school or not. Because what it is just saying, you must be this tall to ride. And you get to hop on the roller coaster with, a 1400, even if the average at that school is a 1550. So yes, you should still send the score in that case. I can answer this much more specifically if you give me the name of this high school, the name of the college, the score. But I would say, generally speaking, lower end of the middle 50% is usually a submit in the current climate. Do colleges recognize that their middle 50% of test scores are inflated and therefore are more permissive when students would submit test scores that are below the middle 50%, but would have been in the middle 50% pre-pandemic? I'm just going to answer it with one word. Yes, they all know. And they all
did it. They took a thing in test optional that, pre-pandemic, more than 1,000 colleges and universities subscribed to test optional. And the entire point of it was in the spirit of access and equity. And they took something that was in that beautiful, pure spirit and exploited it to increase their own test scores and look more highly rejective and raise in rankings, while declaring it's in the name of access and equity.
and misleading students about it. Yeah.
You notice, people who are still with us, that we do not worship colleges. We respect them, we work with them, but we don't let them get away with things.
No, certainly not. In terms of identity essays, if I went through a health crisis, would that count as a part of an identity essay?
Absolutely. Going to shape your perspectives, perhaps how you interact with the community, what you contribute. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, next question might be a long shot because this is definitely outside of my wheelhouse, but college outcomes at most selective private schools in Asia were dramatically stronger this year for Ivy League colleges compared to last year. Any idea why that happened?
I'd like to see proof of that.
Yeah, I don't think any of us have any kind of special insight.
Well, I don't have any data that I've seen that suggests that. So I'd like to see some proof that that was the case.
I do want to acknowledge, it could be true though, right? And the flip side, another lens to look at that question through, not that it's answering in any way, is, there's been trends at private schools here in the United States, especially,
Sure.
of anti-privilege, and, they don't have the edge, or at least as much of an edge as they used to. And it's impacted the way that private school, independent school, college counselors are speaking with their students. I was talking with a couple of very frustrated parents about this phenomenon in the past week or two, and the tone shift and the expectation managing that's going on. And, it's not to say that there aren't changes for better or worse at any group of schools, but yeah, I think we would need.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. I would like to see data that suggests that that is the case, that those schools are doing better, quote unquote, because then I would have some kind of baseline from which to work to explore why that's the case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have 3 more questions.
Yeah.
And, so does that mean that a significant percentage of students do gain acceptance after being waitlisted? This way back at the beginning of our talk. And no, each school is going to be different on a case-by-case basis. In fact, there's many schools in the past year or two where they waitlisted many kids and then accepted 0 off the wait list. So just because more are being waitlisted does not necessarily mean a direct correlation that more are getting off the wait list.
Right. A general trend of more students getting off wait lists, but how significant that ever is at a specific school we don't have a crystal ball for that.
Is the national state rank of your high school you're attending an important factor in the admission decision-making process? This is a question that, I mean, the short answer is yes, it absolutely matters. This goes back to the point a moment ago, how rural high schools have been overlooked for far too long. And you can be a valedictorian at a rural high school, you know, that's lower ranked in the state. And valedictorians aren't getting into top tier colleges, you know, because their high school is not looked at as highly reputed. You know, it's actually this one, it's an interesting thing, right? It's like, it's in your control what high school you go to, if you can move and switch districts and whatnot, but like, let's be honest, really for most people, it's not, right?
not,
Like in
right.
theory, you could change your high school because this is true. It does impact the decision-making progress, but that's why we never say this is something that's in your control.
But it is something that you can control within your location, so that if you can use the resources that your high school provides and use them in such a way that shows the college that while you may not have the achievement that others have, you have the potential to get there. That can really help you.
Yeah, and one thing to just note as a piece of information is that attached to your transcript when you apply to college is something called a school profile that contains some information about your high school, including average SAT and ACT score, what APs are offered, percentage of students who are going to go on for a 4-year degree. So colleges get a lot of information about your high school with your application. So they're going to factor that in different ways in different places, but it is something that definitely impacts things. I think the one thing that Eric and I seem to always land on with this is that there's no better advantage for your student than going to an excellent high school. So you might think like, well, you know, going to a school where so many students are applying to all these selective schools, it makes it harder for my student to compete. Like, there's no better advantage in life than getting an actual good education. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind when we talk about, you know, the school you're applying from and how it affects things. Your student's going to be well prepared to succeed wherever they go if you're applying from a highly ranked school.
Building off that, there's a direct question going to this. What if your school profile stinks and is missing a lot of the info you just mentioned, and you can't get the school to change it? I would rally the forces of the community, and I would be speaking loudly at PTA meetings and writing petitions. And if you get enough people to yell about it, my guess is they'll change. But trust the person wrote back, oh, trust me, we have. Sigas, you may have more insights into this. I mean,
I put in the chat, there's on the website of the National Association for College Admissions Counseling, NACAC, there is a place called the Knowledge Center, and it is open to the public. The Knowledge Center is not just for members, it's open to the public. There's a specific place in the Knowledge Center where about 1,200 high school profiles are displayed. Take a look at some of those, bring those back to your high school. Secondly, typically, the high school profile is assigned to one individual, almost always the director of curriculum or the director of counseling. Okay, that's nice if they know what they're doing. But I don't understand why this is not, I don't get it, why this is not some kind of group project. Like, why isn't there a committee? Teachers, students, counselors, administration, parents. Why isn't there a committee that brings that school profile to being?
But to the parent who answered this question, right? Because, you know, I think my response thinking about it is, you know, I go back to one of my core tenets, which is, you know, think about what's in your control. There's that 650 word additional information section. If you know that the school profile is missing key insights that help contextualize your student's application and academic and extracurricular success, utilize that section yourself.
Yep.
You speak up if they're not going to, and say, you know, just to be clear, right? This is the number of APs that were taken by my student you know, versus what was offered, and, you know, go down the list and say it.
Right.
No
Right.
one, and I say this to students all the time, no one cares about you more than you do, right? And you have to take ownership over your own narrative.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you for that, Eric.
If you don't write your narrative,
Yeah.
someone else is going to write it for you, whether it's mental health, whether it's your grades, whether it's testing, it does not matter. And that's why, you know, I just emphasize all the time, like, you have to ask yourself, how would you look at yourself if you were a stranger? Answer that question and then ask yourself, what am I going to write on the application so that someone else can't write that narrative for me? And look, it may not be great, right? It may be hard. You know, this comes up all the time with mental health, right? People worry, how are people going to judge me? Well, guess what? They're making an assessment of you with, you know, if you don't say it. So
Right.
you may as
Either
well say
way.
it and at least let them make a connection with you. And it's scary and it's vulnerable. And they still may not take you.
Yeah.
But that
These
doesn't mean they didn't like you or appreciate you more.
Yeah, these college admissions people are strangers. They don't know you, so you want to let them know. I would say the vast majority of times when my students have used the additional information section, it has been to enhance the school profile. So let me give you an example from one of our local schools. They have math and computer science classes that go beyond AP. One of the classes is called linear algebra. Well, it's designated honors because it's a weighted class. But if I'm not really up on how the math sequence works, maybe I didn't major in math when I went to college. Maybe I didn't even make it to calculus when I was in college. And now I'm sitting as an admissions officer. I see a student that has AP Calculus BC or IB Math HL as one of their classes in junior year. Now I see honors linear algebra. What am I thinking? This kid's taking an easy algebra class to get an easy A. So for students that are in that position, in their additional information, please note that the honors linear algebra class is post AP. That's an example.
I just want to give a quick thing, Jim. I'm not sure what you typed to the question of, you know, asking about our thoughts on, you know, colleges for students with special needs. And I just want to quickly acknowledge, and I'm sure Sigus will echo this before we answer the last question, which is just, I have lots of thoughts, but the one thought I want to say here to everyone is, like, it really stinks that you're going to have to do more research than other students. It's not simple as saying, I want a warm weather school with a sports team, and I can go on the ESPN.com. There's no rankings. There's no simple list. There's no easy Google search. You're going to have to talk to families. You're going to have to go on forums. This is a case where social media and online forums probably would be beneficial to hear experiences. But, you know, look, and it's not just about special needs. Anytime there's some niche need, whether you're a marine biology major or you have a learning difference, it means you have to do some extra work. And ultimately, if you're willing and able to do that extra work, it's a great thing. But let's not call it what it is. It's extra work. And if you're already dealing with learning differences, which could mean extra time getting accommodations, standardized tests, let alone grades, that can be painful and really difficult, that now we're saying you need extra time to research your
To do the research. Man, absolutely right, Eric. Great point.
Last question, getting back the private school versus public. Anecdotally, have you seen better outcomes this year with better public schools versus better private schools? I don't think it's a contest. I don't think it's, you know, one group of schools did better than another. And I think that's my answer. I think, again, it's just, it goes back to, is this the craziest year ever? There's slight shifting, but it's not a contest or a competition that someone won.
Right.
Yeah, and I
And
should add that we don't work with a representative enough sample from any one school. We don't work
No.
with a significant amount of their, you know, applying class to even be able to really answer that.
right, right. And do note also that some of the better public schools are magnet schools. they might as well just be private. They just happen to only serve a particular public school group of students. But you have to take a test to get in. You have to be nominated to get in. They're not just better high schools. They're specifically selected high schools.
Well,
Well, this is fun.
This was great. Thank you to all the troopers who hung around for 2 full hours of admissions talk with us today.
Yeah.
Really
great. And
appreciate
who
your time.
listens to this recording, thank you for listening to the whole thing
Yes,
too. And
absolutely.
thank you for joining us again, as every year. We
Yeah.
so appreciate your wisdom and friendship.
Always the
There's-
best.
If there's one thing I can ask of our audience, if you found this helpful, please share it with other families. I mean, we put this information out there to help people, and the more people we can reach, the better.
Yeah. There's
Thank
a lot
you.
of anxiety and mystery in this process. The reason we do this in all our webinars all year long is we really believe the more information we put out there, the more we can quell stress and anxiety and worries about the process. It's that old, the more you know, the more
Yeah.
empowered you feel. It's not that any one particular thing is very hard to navigate, but we understand and recognize the sheer quantity of all of this. And we're here to help you all navigate it and empower you.
Indeed. Indeed. Everybody be well, and see you next year.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.